technologies such as advanced manufacturing and robotics, artificial intelligence, and high-performance computing to drive productivity gains and spur growth in the future. Yet he is increasingly concerned about the United States' ability to interfere with China's technological goals. Consequently, PRC leaders modified their approach to economic retaliation against the United States over the last year, imposing at least some tangible costs on U.S. firms. And we remain of the view, though, that in the coming months, they are likely to limit the level of economic retaliation they engage in order to avoid the domestic costs of such actions. In particular, the significant decline in foreign direct investment in China, down 77.5% in 2023, is likely to prompt the PRC to be more measured in their responses absent an unexpected escalation by the United States. And rather than engaging in direct economic retaliation that might result in such negative domestic economic consequences, the PRC's tactics are evolving to promote an increasingly sophisticated exploitation of loopholes, avoid detection, engage in stockpiling. Moreover, the PRC also remains focused on achieving its regional and global ambitions, which warrants from their leadership's perspective a strategy that boosts China's indigenous innovation and technological self-reliance, supports efforts to acquire, steal, or compel the production of intellectual property and capabilities, and controls critical global supply chains that provide the leverage to achieve certain geopolitical outcomes to their advantage. And furthermore, given its ambitions, Beijing will continue to use its military forces to intimidate its neighbors and to shape the region's actions in accordance with the PRC's priorities, most obviously in relation to Taiwan as the PRC presses for unification. And we expect the PLA will field more advanced platforms, deploy new technologies, grow more competent in joint operations, and seek to strengthen their nuclear forces and cyber capabilities while also seeking to divide us from our allies in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific. In the meantime, China is working to develop its own form of multilateralism while deepening its relationship with Russia and Iran in particular. In fact, China's provision of dual-use components and material to Russia's defense industry is one of several factors that tilted the momentum on the battlefield in Ukraine in Moscow's favor, while also accelerating a reconstitution of Russia's military strength after their extraordinarily costly invasion. When it comes to Ukraine, we assess that President Putin thinks that domestic and international trends are in his favor. Russia is making incremental progress on the battlefield with the potential for tactical breakthroughs along the front lines in areas such as Donetsk and Kharkiv. And publicly, Putin touts his ammunition and missile production capacity in contrast with what he portrays as significant U.S., European, and Ukrainian limitations. He likely views his position based on Russia's economic trajectory, rearmament efforts, and his political staying power as advantageous compared with the challenges facing the Ukrainians, including the hard fight here and in Europe for continued support for Ukraine. Like Ukraine, Putin has for months indicated a willingness to enter into talks with Ukraine and the United States about the future for Ukraine, but without any indication that he is willing to make significant concessions. Putin's increasingly aggressive tactics against Ukraine, such as the strikes on Ukraine's electricity infrastructure, are intended to impress on Ukraine that continuing to fight will only increase the damage to Ukraine and offer no plausible path to victory. By targeting critical infrastructure, Moscow aims to create logistical hurdles that impede Ukraine's ability to move forces and supplies to the front, slow Ukrainian defense production, and build pressure for Kyiv to consider pathways out of the war, including through negotiations. And these aggressive tactics are likely to continue, and the war is unlikely to end anytime soon. In fact, in a major change in fiscal policy, President Putin has increased defense spending to almost 7% of Russia's GDP, nearly double the historical average. The defense budget now accounts for roughly 25% of federal spending in Russia. And in many ways, this is prompted by the fact that Russia has paid an enormous price for the war in Ukraine. Not only has Russia spent hundreds of billions of dollars, suffered more military losses than in any time since World War II, with more than 300,000 casualties, but the war precipitated Finland's and Sweden's membership in NATO, which Putin believes requires an expansion of Russia's ground forces. And Putin continues to judge that Russia is under threat and almost certainly assumes that a larger, better-equipped military will drive that point home to Western and domestic audiences. Putin's strategic goals also remain unchanged. He continues to see NATO enlargement and Western support to Ukraine as reinforcing his long-held belief that the United States and Europe seek to restrict Russian power. In turn, he has tried to capitalize on global events, such as the outbreak of the conflict between Israel and Hamas, to divide us from our allies. And the crisis in Gaza is another striking example of how a localized conflict can produce global impact. Nearly 7 months in, the Gaza conflict has roiled the Middle East, presenting new security paradigms and humanitarian challenges while pulling in a range of actors. Most prominently, there was the unprecedented level of attacks between Iran and Israel, with Iran and its proxies launching hundreds of weapons towards Israel in response to Israel's killing of Iranian officials in Damascus. And additionally, cross-border attacks along Israel's northern border with Lebanon continue at a pace and intensity that is controlled but has the potential to escalate, even as we continue to assess that Hezbollah does not want the situation to develop into an all-out war with Israel and the United States. And as of last week, the Houthis resumed nearly daily maritime attacks after announcing last month that they intend to escalate strikes and expand their hostile actions to the Indian Ocean. And meanwhile, Iranian-aligned militia groups in the region continue to plan attacks against our forces, but have broadly paused conducting such attacks, though it is not clear how long that pause will last. Moreover, the crisis has galvanized violence by a range of actors around the world. Both al-Qaeda and ISIS, inspired by Hamas, have directed supporters to conduct attacks against Israel and U.S. interests, demonstrating yet again the degree to which so many threat streams have system effects. Finally, I'll just end by talking about the increasing challenge associated with one of our most pernicious transnational threats, cyber attacks. We have seen a massive increase in the number of ransomware attacks globally in the last year, which went up as much as 74%. in 2023. U.S. entities were the most heavily targeted, with attacks against the healthcare sector roughly doubling what they had been the year before. And moreover, this year, cyber actors are attacking U.S. industrial control systems, which are typically used to automate industrial processes at record levels. Many critical infrastructure sectors, including water and wastewater, food and agriculture, defense, energy, and transportation, rely on such systems. And although the likelihood of any single attack having a widespread effect on interrupting critical services remains low, the increased number of attacks and the actors' willingness to access and manipulate these control systems increases the collective odds that at least one could have a more significant impact. And in virtually all of the attacks we've seen against U.S. critical infrastructure, cyber actors took advantage of default or weak passwords, unpatched known vulnerabilities, and poorly secured network connections to launch relatively simple attacks. And for this reason, it is crucial that all of us, particularly critical infrastructure owners and operators, improve our cybersecurity practices to reduce our vulnerability to such efforts. State actors can, of course, use more sophisticated capabilities to more reliably cause greater disruptions by breaching better defended targets, resulting in, for example, multiple failures at once. State actors, however, also tend to recognize their own vulnerabilities and are unlikely to engage in attacks on critical infrastructure unless they are at war. Instead, these actors put a premium on preparing offensive capability, basically during peacetime, in part by preemptively planting footholds in our infrastructure. And what is often the case, particularly in the context of ransomware attacks, is that we are dealing with unaffiliated cyber actors focused on obtaining money, power, or hacktivists who seek notoriety for specific causes. And there are, of course, so many threats and scenarios that I haven't covered in my opening remarks, but I hope we can do so when we get to your questions. And most of all, thank you for your support for the intelligence community's work and also for the work on 702 reauthorization. We very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director. General Cruz, please.
Chairman Reed, Ranking Member Wicker, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to join Director Haynes in presenting our assessment of the global security environment. I'd like to streamline my opening comments this morning first by echoing the DNI's overall assessments in her remarks, as well as her thanks to the men and women of the intelligence community. The Defense Intelligence Agency alone has officers in more than 140 nations around the globe, and we are joined by thousands more from across the 18 members of the IC. And with your support, they are world-class in their commitment and their results. And it's a privilege to represent them and their work before the committee. The national security arena's complexity, trajectory, and rate of change is perhaps the highest and most consequential we've seen in several decades. How we respond matters, and our level of innovation, focus, and integration must equal or outpace that of our adversaries. In this vein, I would offer three overarching themes beyond what the DNI has already mentioned that are the most concerning to me as the Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. First is that while individually threats are growing, whether specific countries or rapid growth in malign use of advanced technology, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, unmanned systems, or cyber, there are a growing number of adversaries who are interacting and partnering in ways and toward ends that we have not seen before. Historical friction points are no longer governing their relationships, and the new resulting partnerships are still nascent and untested, meaning how we predict and shape their trajectory is nascent and untested as well. Second, while much of our collection, our analysis, our modernization, and our engagements are laser-focused on near and mid-term issues and impacts in Ukraine, the Indo-Pacific, and the Middle East, the long-term trajectory in these regions and the impacts on the United States are equally troubling and perhaps even more far-reaching. For example, how events in Ukraine play out in the months ahead will be critical and will impact how Russia emerges postured and emboldened for potential future conflict with its neighbors, including NATO. Similarly, the Chinese Communist Party's national and military plans are not solely focused on Taiwan and the South China Sea in the 2020s, but also on securing an entirely new place for the People's Republic of China throughout the 2030s and the 2040s. These ambitions and their associated military, space, cyber, and nuclear expansion to entice or compel outcomes are at the expense of their neighbors, the region, the United States, and the open international system. And in the Middle East, as mentioned, how the current conflict between Hamas and Israel is resolved is likely to determine regional dynamics for decades. Consequently, how we view and adequately prepare for these longer-term outcomes is a near-term issue with near-term actions required. And then finally, the third issue is our unquestionable need to protect our networks, our data, and our people from the pervasive threat of cyber actors, foreign intelligence entities, and insider threats. This includes not only the sophisticated capabilities of state actors, such as Russia and China, but also rogue cyber actors loosely aligned to governments. In addition to what Director Haynes has already stated on the growing threat to critical infrastructure in local governments, this threat directly endangers our defense industrial capabilities, our hard-won technological and military advantages, our allies and partners, and our future defense operations. We must partner, invest, and integrate in new ways to secure what we value and safeguard the assured resiliency of our networks, the data, and the people. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee today. We are grateful for the committee's longstanding partnership and support, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, General, for both the Director and the General. The intelligence community, I believe, and correct me if I'm inaccurate, concluded that Iran was not aware prior to the attack by Hamas of the operation, but they seem to be exploiting it significantly and by using their proxies throughout the region. And as you pointed out, Director Haynes, our retaliation in September, 82 different strikes, has for the moment inhibited many of their proxies. Still, the Houthis are conducting operations. Can you give me an assessment of the Iranian strategy? Is it reactive or proactive? Are they trying to organize, a decisive victory, or are they simply reacting to what's going on, or are they trying to take advantage of what's going on?
Thank you so much, Chairman. I think really it's a combination of all of those things, which is to say that even though we don't assess that they were aware of the particular attack at the moment that it occurred in the way that it did, they obviously have been supportive of Hamas in the past, have provided funding and training and other assistance of different types. And the reality is that in many ways they support efforts to counter Israel, as we've seen. They see Israel as their enemy, and they have long done so. And so as things have developed, I think they're taking advantage of every opportunity to ultimately try to undermine the state of Israel in many respects. So that is certainly part of what they're doing. It is also, I think, true that they're looking to take advantage of opportunities to enhance their influence in the region. That is something that, again, they have long worked on, whether it's through the Iranian-aligned militia groups that we're all aware of in the region, or through their relationship with the Houthis, or through their relationship with Hamas, and of course one of their closest partners, Hezbollah. And so in supporting them and in also increasing their influence, there is a kind of a long-term strategy of trying to enhance that, including in countries like Iraq and so on. And so I think that's a fair, but General Cruz may have more to add.
I think I would just echo a couple of things that the DNI mentioned. One is that they have had a long-term strategy over many decades, and they have been long-term suppliers and supporters of the groups already mentioned. Within that larger strategy, this conflict came into being, and they've used every opportunity to take advantage of the circumstances. I wouldn't call it necessarily reactive, but the ability to, within their larger construct, increase their influence and come out. At some point, this conflict will end. Iran has gone through various sets of calculus over time about escalation or not escalating, and I think they're navigating a path by which they think they can create more influence within the region for the longer-term environment that we'll find at the end of the existing conflict.
In looking at China, you mentioned, Director Haynes, that, and both, I think, General Cruz, that they're trying to use their economic power throughout the world, supply chains. That seems to be a particular case with strategic minerals. Do you see us in a fight, quote unquote, over securing adequate strategic minerals? Because these are essential to batteries and other things that could be the source of power in the next generation.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think one way to think about this is as follows. They have used rare earth elements and critical minerals as a leverage point for achieving geopolitical outcomes in different spaces, because I think they both recognize their capacity with respect to mining and processing is significant, and it gives them the ability to sort of move forward on a plan for how do we control the global supply chains in these areas, and recognizing that these are incredibly important to the prosperity of many economic futures for different countries. And moving forward, they've seen the ability to use that, again, as a leverage point. And what we've seen in this area, and I think there's sort of history is a useful lesson in this, which is to say that they have actually passed laws that, from dating back decades now even, for being able to control the rare earth elements. And we saw them actually use this first, I think, in the context of a dispute with Japan over the Senkaku Islands, where they ultimately use their leverage there by cutting off exports that were important to Japan's economy at the time as a way of pressuring them in the context of a land dispute and a maritime dispute. So, I mean, I think that's an example of what we've seen. We've also seen them pass export controls of gallium and uranium more recently and other things that are important. And again, using this as a leverage point. And I think, what we've been trying to do is try to help policymakers understand how they're approaching this, where they are getting close to having control over a critical supply chain, and then being able to highlight opportunities for trying to disrupt that so that we can maintain resilience in these areas.
Thank you. No need for response to that unless I'm inaccurate, but one of their key advantages is they do a tremendous amount of refining. So these minerals could be, in fact, I think Australia has a huge cache of these minerals, but the refining is all done in China, and that's the choke point.
Yeah, lithium is a good example of this. Yeah.
Senator Fish, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here today. Director Haynes, in the 24 annual threat assessment, it stated that if Beijing believed that a major conflict with the United States were imminent, it would consider aggressive cyber operations against U.S. critical infrastructure and military assets. Such a strike would be designed to deter U.S. military action by impeding U.S. decision-making, inducing societal panic, and interfering with the deployment of U.S. forces. In your opening comments, you mentioned how Chinese cyber actors are currently working to disrupt and destroy some of our critical infrastructure, putting things in place for future possibilities of using that. In this setting, can you provide us with any examples of this type of malign cyber activity?
So, yes, I think, just to be precise, but I think consistent with what you just said, what we see is both China and Russia effectively trying to pre-position themselves in ways that would allow them to conduct those kinds of attacks, not actually yet necessarily engaging in those attacks. And obviously, we can discuss this further in a closed session. And I can get back to you. I think we do have one or two examples that we've declassified of where they've tried to produce such footholds, essentially, in infrastructure. So I'll do so in follow-up.
Okay. Does the intelligence community work at all with our utility companies and others so that you can increase awareness about the possibility of attacks and how these companies can work with you to help mitigate their vulnerabilities?
Yes, we do so largely through, for example, CISA for cybersecurity related to critical infrastructure. But we are very heavily working with them to ensure that they're able to provide the kind of warnings that you're describing for critical infrastructure across the board. And this is something that we spend quite a bit of time on. And as I indicated, we are seeing this sort of significant increase in attacks on control systems, which is so important to critical infrastructure. So much of our critical infrastructure relies on these types of automated control systems that are vulnerable to cyber attack. But again, what's sort of working through exactly the attribution chain of where those attacks are coming from is quite challenging, and that's something that we spend quite a bit of time on. And again, as I indicated, so many of those attacks are basically possible as a consequence of just not engaging in good cybersecurity practices, not updating passwords, not doing the kind of work that needs to be done, patching vulnerabilities that we're aware of. We will put out, the government will put out notices essentially about such vulnerabilities, and we really think it's crucial for folks to do those types of cybersecurity practices, because if they did